The dress had been folded on top of the wooden chest for 3 days. Daisy hadn't had the courage to touch it since arriving at Vorthane Castle. Not because it was ugly, quite the opposite. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen up close. Oat-colored linen with embroidery along the sleeves, sewn by her own mother in the final weeks before she left, by the light of a candle that barely had enough tallow to last until the work was done. Every stitch made with waxed thread carried a silent hope. Every knot, a promise. You'll walk into that castle as a maid, but you'll walk out as a bride, her mother had said, pressing Daisy's hands between hers. Daisy was 23 years old and carried those words like an amulet. Not gold, not rare stone, just words. But sometimes words were the only kind of wealth in Omega without a pack, without an important name, and without land could keep for herself. She arranged her blonde hair into a simple braid, pulled the gray cloak over her shoulders, and went down to the work hall before the sun had warmed the courtyard stones. Vorthane Castle was vast and cold, even during the harvest season. The dark granite walls absorbed the moisture of the forest that surrounded the entire estate, and the smell that filled the corridors was a constant blend of burning resin, cured leather, and aged wine. Iron-forged torches lit the hallways even during daylight, because the narrow windows let in little light. The banners of the Vorthane Pack, a black wolf on a silver field, hung from oak beams above every main doorway. Daisy had arrived 1 week earlier, hired as a chamber assistant by Lord Edric Vorthane, eldest son of the Pack Council and heir to the title of Lord of the Northern Border. Edric was 30 years old, broad-shouldered, and wore a smile the way someone uses a tool, calculated, applied when necessary, put away when it no longer served a purpose. They had known each other since childhood. Their families had lived near one another for years, before Daisy's father lost everything in a debt of honor poorly settled with a pack from the east. Since then, her family had descended in the hierarchy with the speed of a stone dropped into deep water. But Edric had promised. He had promised before she left, promised by letter, promised with enough words to fill an entire chest. "When you arrive at the castle," he had written, "I will present you to the council as my chosen. You won't need to be a maid for long." Daisy had folded that letter and tucked it inside the embroidered dress, between the 2 layers of fabric. It was the second layer of hope she carried. The work of a maid was exhausting, but she didn't complain. She woke before the others, carried water from the inner courtyard wells, helped organize the upper chambers, and served at the council's smaller meals. She had quickly learned where everything was kept, who preferred their wine watered down and who drank it straight, which corridors were always watched, and which ones the guards forgot during shift changes. It wasn't out of curiosity that she paid attention to all of this. It was instinct. A woman without protection learns to read her surroundings before she needs them. The other maid who shared her small room on the lower floor was named Nara, a wolf from a lesser pack, dark-haired, with eyes that laughed before her mouth did. They had grown close quickly, the way people do when they sleep in the same cramped space and need to trust each other to endure the cold of stone-walled nights. "You're different from the others who've come to work here," Nara had said on the 3rd night, staring at the ceiling while the hearth crackled softly. "Different how?" "The others look at the servants. You look at the walls." Daisy hadn't answered. But Nara was right. She looked at the walls because she was learning the castle the same way one learns a person, through the details no one thinks matter. It was on Thursday afternoon, 4 days before the Grand Alliance banquet, that Daisy heard what she was never meant to hear. She was in the narrow corridor behind the council room, carrying a tray of clean goblets to the service cabinet. The door was ajar, just a finger's width, but enough to let voices through when the castle was quiet. Edric's voice was unmistakable, deep, well-placed, always sounding as though every word had been calculated before being spoken. "The decision is made," he said. "The council approved. I'll make the announcement at the banquet. Are you certain?" The responding voice was female, older. Most likely Lady Solvane, Edric's mother, a woman whose eyes assessed everything with the precision of someone who had spent decades managing alliances. The Dreskin family has direct influence over 3 southern territories. Their name is worth more than any old promise. I know what things are worth, Mother. Then you know the Dreskin girl is the right choice. A pause. The other girl? That Omega you brought here. Send her away after the banquet. With a coin purse if you want to seem generous. But send her away. Silence. She'll understand, said Edric, and there was a lightness in those words that hurt more than any direct cruelty would have. As though Daisy were a simple matter, easily resolved, carrying no weight. Daisy stood in the corridor long enough for the goblets on the tray to grow cold. Then she set the tray down on the floor carefully, without making a sound, and returned to her room without anyone seeing her. Nara noticed immediately that something had changed. She didn't ask. She simply pulled the chair beside the hearth and waited, with the patient silence of someone who has learned that some things need to find their own way out. Daisy sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, staring at the chest where the embroidered dress waited. My mother sewed every stitch of that dress, she finally said, her voice low but steady. She stayed up late for weeks, with the candle almost gone. Nara said nothing, but her dark eyes were attentive. He's going to dismiss me after the banquet, Daisy continued, with a coin purse, to seem generous. The fire crackled, the wood was damp, and the smell of smoke mixed with the old leather scent that filled that entire wing of the castle. What are you going to do? Nara asked. Daisy was quiet for longer than Nara expected. Then she raised her eyes, and there was something in them that hadn't been there before. Not anger, not despair. It was something deeper and quieter than either of those. I'm going to the banquet, she said. Daisy. Not as a maid. She opened the chest and lifted the dress carefully, holding it by the shoulders. My mother didn't sew this for me to keep it in a chest, and I won't let this night end as though I never existed to him. Nara studied her face for a long moment. Then she nodded, stood up, and reached for the wooden comb on the narrow shelf. Then let's do your braid properly, she said. The Grand Alliance banquet was the most important event on Vorthane's calendar that year. Representatives from 6 packs had arrived at the castle in the days before. The corridors were filled with cloaks embroidered with clan symbols, and the air in the main hall smelled of spiced warm wine, roasted meat, and the thick smoke of dozens of torches burning at once. Daisy entered through the side corridor that connected the service chambers to the main hall. She wore her mother's embroidered linen, her golden braid secured with a thin leather cord that Nara had found at the bottom of an old chest. No jewels, no title. Just herself. Standing straight, hands lightly clasped in front of her, looking out at the crowded hall with open eyes and the steady posture of someone who had decided that, whatever happened that night, she would not leave Bent. It was precisely at that moment that the great doors at the far end of the hall swung open, and Alpha King Tristan of Aldraven walked into Vorthane Castle. He had not been announced. No one had expected him. That much was clear from the way the hall responded, not with applause or formal greeting, but with the particular stillness that falls over a room when something enters it that is fundamentally more powerful than everything already inside. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Goblets paused halfway to mouths. Even the torches seemed to dim slightly, as though the room itself was adjusting to accommodate something larger than itself. Tristan of Aldraven moved through the entrance with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never needed to announce himself to be noticed. He was tall, taller than most in the hall, with long, dark braids pulled back from a face that carried the kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from absolute control. His armor was black leather, reinforced with iron at the shoulders, crossed with thick straps that spoke of practical use rather than decoration. A dark fur mantle hung from his left shoulder, pinned with a clasp shaped like a wolf mid-stride. There was a faint scar along his jaw, barely visible beneath the short dark beard, and his eyes, pale, almost silver in the torchlight, moved across the hall with the slow precision of someone cataloging everything at once. Behind him came two men. The first walked slightly to his right, younger looking, with a sharp jaw and an expression that hovered permanently on the edge of amusement, as though he found the world consistently entertaining in ways others didn't. His name, Daisy would learn later, was Corvin, the Alpha King's youngest commander, and by all accounts, the most difficult person in Aldravon to say no to. The second walked to Tristan's left and said nothing, and looked at nothing specific, and was somehow the most unsettling of the three. Broad through the chest, with close-cropped gray-streaked hair despite his apparent age, and the flat, calm expression of someone who had resolved every question about violence a long time ago. His name was Aldred. He carried no visible weapon, which somehow made him more alarming than if he'd carried 10. Lord Edric was on his feet within seconds, moving toward the entrance with the practiced smoothness of a host who had been caught off guard, but would not show it. "Alpha King Tristan," he said, inclining his head. "We were not informed of your arrival. Vorthane is honored." "I travel without announcements when I choose to," Tristan said. His voice was even, neither warm nor cold. It simply was, the way stone simply is. "I received word of the Alliance banquet. I had business in the north. The timing was convenient." "Of course." Edric gestured broadly toward the high table. "Please, the best seats in the hall are yours." Tristan didn't move immediately toward the offered seats. Instead, his silver eyes moved across the hall in that same slow, methodical way, taking inventory, reading the room, reading the people in it. And then they stopped. Daisy became aware of it the way one becomes aware of a change in temperature, gradually, then all at once. She was still standing near the side entrance, one hand resting lightly on the stone wall beside her, and the Alpha King of Aldravon was looking directly at her. She didn't look away. She didn't know why. It was not the wisest thing, holding the gaze of the most powerful Alpha in the Northern Territories. But something in her refused to lower her eyes first. She met his look steadily, and for 3 full seconds, neither of them moved. Then Corvin leaned slightly toward Tristan and said something low near his ear, and Tristan turned his attention back to Edric, and the moment ended as quietly as it had begun. Daisy released a breath she hadn't noticed she was holding. The banquet progressed the way formal events always do, loudly, with much wine and little honesty. Daisy took her place near the side wall with the other household staff, serving when needed, stepping back when not. She watched Edric at the high table, laughing with the Dreskin family representatives, filling their goblets himself, an unusual gesture of personal attention that was not lost on anyone observing. Beside the Dreskin delegation sat a young woman Daisy had seen arrive 2 days earlier. Saren Dreskin was dark-haired and composed, dressed in deep burgundy wool trimmed with silver thread. She was the kind of compose that takes years of careful instruction to achieve. She said little, smiled at precise moments, and kept her eyes forward in a way that communicated awareness of exactly how much the room was watching her. Daisy watched Edric lean toward her and say something that made the young woman smile, and felt nothing she hadn't already felt in the corridor that afternoon. The hurt had already done its work. What remained was simply clarity. Nara appeared at her elbow without warning, refilling a nearby pitcher as cover. "The Alpha King keeps looking this direction," she murmured, not moving her lips much. "He's reading the room," Daisy said quietly. "That's what powerful people do. He's been reading this particular corner of the room 4 times in the last quarter hour." Daisy didn't answer. The formal announcement came after the 3rd course, when the hall had grown warm and loud enough that Lord Edric had to raise his hand for quiet. He stood at the high table with his goblet lifted and the room settled into the expectant hush that precedes declarations. "Tonight," Edric began, his voice carrying easily, "in the presence of our honored allies and guests, I am pleased to announce an alliance that will strengthen Vorthane's ties with the South." He turned toward Saren Dreskin, who rose gracefully from her seat. "It is my intention to formalize a union with the House of Dreskin before the next full moon. I ask the Council and our gathered allies to bear witness to this declaration." The hall responded with the expected sounds: approval, the tapping of goblets on tables, a few formal words from the older council members. It was all very clean, very arranged, very bloodless. Daisy stood very still against the wall. She had known it was coming since that afternoon. Knowing hadn't made it smaller exactly, but it had given it a shape she could hold without breaking. She breathed slowly through her nose, pine resin, candle smoke, old stone, and kept her eyes forward and her hands loose at her sides. She would not cry here. She would not make a sound. What she would do was leave. She set down the cloth she'd been holding, smoothed the front of her mother's dress once with both hands, and began moving quietly along the wall toward the side corridor. If she could reach it without being noticed, she could be back in her room before anyone thought to look for her. She would pack what little she had tonight. She would be gone before the castle woke. She was 4 steps from the corridor entrance when a voice reached her. Not loud, not commanding in the way of someone accustomed to shouting orders, just present, clear and level, cutting through the noise the way a stone thrown into still water doesn't shout. It simply moves everything around it. "You're leaving before the wine has gone cold." She stopped. Corvin was leaning against the wall 2 feet to her left, arms crossed, goblet in one hand, watching her with that expression of permanent mild amusement. He had moved there without her noticing, which told her he was considerably more skilled at reading rooms than he appeared. "I wasn't a guest," she said, keeping her voice even. "I was working." "You're wearing embroidered linen to work," he said, glancing briefly at her dress. "That's either very dedicated professionalism or something else entirely." She said nothing. "My name is Corvin," he offered, as though they were having a perfectly ordinary conversation. "I'm annoyingly perceptive and occasionally useful." "You are?" "Someone leaving," she said. "Daisy," said a second voice. She turned. Tristan of Aldraven stood 3 feet away, and she had not heard him approach either, which was considerably more alarming given his size. He was not looking at Corvin. He was looking at her, with that same still, silver attention he had turned on her when he'd first entered the hall. Up close, the scar along his jaw was more visible, and his eyes were lighter than she'd realized. Not unkind, simply very, very attentive. "That is your name?" he said. It was not a question. She straightened slightly. "It is." "Then you are Daisy," he said, "and you are not leaving yet." Behind her, the hall continued its noise. Edric laughed at something near the high table, unaware. The torches burned. The banners of Vorthane swayed faintly in a draft from somewhere high in the rafters. Daisy looked at the Alpha King of Aldravon and understood, with sudden and complete certainty, that the night was not over. It had, in fact, just changed entirely. She did not move toward the corridor. She wasn't entirely sure why. It would have been simpler, cleaner, to excuse herself with a small nod and disappear into the dark passage behind her. She had planned exactly that. She had already said goodbye to this hall in her mind, to this castle, to the version of the night she had imagined for months. Walking away would have been the sensible thing. But Tristan of Aldravon was still looking at her, and there was something in that attention that was not pressure and not command. It was more like recognition, the kind that happens when something familiar appears in an unexpected place, and the person who sees it goes very still because they don't want to lose it before understanding what it is. "I have no reason to stay," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. That may be true, Tristan replied. But I would like to speak with you if you're willing. Not here. Corvin was already pushing off the wall with the easy movement of someone accustomed to making himself scarce at precise moments. I'll go ensure Aldred hasn't frightened anyone irreparably, he said pleasantly, and disappeared back into the crowd with remarkable efficiency. Tristan gestured toward a narrower door set into the stone beside the main corridor, one of the castle's old reading rooms, used now mainly for storage between council sessions. Daisy knew it. She had dusted the shelves in there 2 days ago. She knew the room held 3 chairs, a table buried under old maps, and a single window that looked out over the eastern courtyard where the horses were kept. She followed him inside. The room smelled of parchment and cold wax. A single torch burned in the wall bracket, and the window was dark, the courtyard below lit only by the distant glow of the stable lanterns. Tristan didn't sit. He moved to the window and looked out for a moment, hands clasped behind his back, before turning to face her. How long have you been at Vorthane? He asked. 1 week, she said. And before that? My family's village. 3 days' ride east of here. He nodded once, filing that away. You came as household staff. Yes. But that's not the only reason you came. It wasn't a challenge. It was simply an observation, offered the way one offers a fact, without accusation or mockery. Daisy looked at him for a moment, measuring the space between what she could say and what she had no reason to hide from a man she had met 20 minutes ago. No, she said finally. It wasn't the only reason. Edric Vorthane made you a promise. She went still. You know Lord Edric well? I know men like him well, Tristan said, and there was no cruelty in it, only the particular flatness of someone describing terrain they have crossed many times. I heard the announcement tonight. I also noticed where you were standing when it was made, and how you carried yourself afterward. Daisy said nothing. You didn't collapse, he continued, and you didn't cause a scene. You decided to leave quietly, and you would have managed it if Corvin weren't constitutionally incapable of letting interesting people walk past him unaddressed. Something moved at the corner of her mouth despite everything. Is that what I am? Interesting? I don't know yet, he said, and the honesty of it was so complete and so unexpected that it actually settled something in her chest, rather than unsettling it. That's why I wanted to speak with you. She studied him for a moment. The stillness of him, the way he occupied the room without filling it with noise or performance. She had met powerful men before. They usually announced themselves constantly, with volume or display or the deliberate occupation of space. Tristan did none of that. He simply stood, and the authority came off him the way heat comes off stone that has been in the sun all day, not aggressive, simply present and undeniable. What do you want to know? She asked. What you intend to do now. She looked at the dark window. The stable lanterns swayed faintly in the courtyard below. I intend to leave in the morning, go home, begin again. Begin what again? Whatever comes next. Do you have a pack to return to? The question landed quietly. She answered it the same way. No. My family lost its pack standing when I was 17. We've been independent since then. Tristan was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone who didn't know what to say, but the silence of someone choosing carefully among several things they could say. An Omega without pack standing, he said, in a territory like this one, is not a safe position to be in. I'm aware. Yet you came here alone. I came here with a reason, she said. The reason is gone. I'll find another one. Something shifted in his expression, barely visible, a slight adjustment around the eyes that on a less controlled face might have been the beginning of something like respect. They were interrupted by Aldred, who opened the door without knocking, which Daisy suspected was simply how Aldred operated, and looked at Tristan with an expression that communicated an entire paragraph in the space of a glance. "The Vorthane Council is asking for you," he said. "Edric is also looking for his household staff." That last part was directed, very deliberately, at Daisy, without any change in Aldred's flat expression. "Tell the council I'll be there shortly," Tristan said. Aldred left, pulling the door behind him. Tristan looked at Daisy. "Don't leave tonight," he said. "I'm asking, not instructing." "Why?" "Because I haven't finished," he said simply. "And because I think you deserve to leave this castle differently than the way Edric Vorthane planned for you to leave it." She looked at him for a long moment. The torch crackled. From far down the corridor came the muffled sounds of the banquet continuing without them. Laughter, the scrape of benches, someone's voice rising briefly above the rest, before settling back into the general noise. "I'll stay until morning," she said. He nodded once. "That's enough." He returned to the hall. She returned to the wall beside the side corridor, where Nara found her within minutes, eyes wide and full of questions she was barely containing. "You were in the reading room," Nara whispered. "With the Alpha King." He wanted to talk. "Daisy," Nara's voice carried the weight of someone trying to communicate the significance of something to a person who was not reacting at the appropriate level. "That is the Alpha King of Aldraven. He rules 7 territories. 7. His pack is the largest in the northern region. He does not pull housemaids into reading rooms to talk about the weather." "We didn't talk about the weather." "What did you talk about?" "What comes next?" Daisy said. Nara stared at her. Then she exhaled slowly through her nose, looked up at the vaulted ceiling briefly as if asking it for patience, and said, "Tell me everything." Across the hall, Edric Vorthane had noticed. He hadn't seen Daisy enter the reading room. He'd been occupied with the Dreskin delegation and the formal pleasantries that follow formal announcements. But he'd seen Tristan return to the hall alone, and he'd seen the Alpha King's eyes move briefly across the room before finding the far wall. And he'd followed that line of sight to where Daisy stood, speaking quietly with the dark-haired maid. He felt something that he might, if pressed, have called unease. Not guilt. Edric was not particularly practiced at guilt, but a kind of operational discomfort. The Alpha King of Aldraven did not take personal interest in the household staff of minor northern lords. The variables had shifted somehow, and he didn't yet know how. He reached for his wine and told himself it meant nothing. Later, when the banquet had thinned and the guests had drifted toward their assigned chambers, Tristan stood in the corridor outside the council room with Corvin and Aldred. The castle was quieter now, just the torch snap and the distant sound of wind finding the gaps in old stone. "Her scent is unusual," Aldred said, without preamble. It was the most words he had spoken all evening. "I noticed," Tristan said. "Old lineage," Aldred continued. "I haven't encountered that particular signature in a long time. Not since—" "I know," Tristan said. Corvin looked between them with the expression of someone watching 2 people have a conversation across a gap he didn't quite have the history to cross. "Are we going to explain this to the rest of the group, or are we doing the thing where you 2 communicate in fragments and I piece it together later?" "Later," said Tristan. "Naturally," said Corvin. Tristan looked down the corridor toward the lower hall where the household staff quarters were, and said nothing more. But he didn't move to retire either, and after a moment Corvin followed his gaze, and even Corvin was quiet. Whatever Daisy was, whatever her presence meant in this castle, in this particular moment, one thing had become clear to all 3 of them. Edric Vorthane had made a significant mistake, and the morning had not yet come. Daisy did not sleep. She lay on the narrow bed in the lower quarters, listening to Nara's steady breathing across the room, and stared at the ceiling while the candle burned down to almost nothing. The embroidered dress hung on the peg by the door. Her mother's work, every stitch visible even in the dim light. She had folded it carefully when she returned from the hall, smoothing each panel with her palms before hanging it, the way one handles something that has survived a difficult night and deserves to be treated gently for it. She thought about what Tristan had said. "I think you deserve to leave this castle differently than the way Edric Vorthane planned for you to leave it." She turned those words over slowly, examining them from different angles the way one examines an unfamiliar object found on a road, trying to determine whether it was dropped by accident or left deliberately. She had met men who said generous things to serve their own purposes. She had also met very few men who said exactly what they meant, without decoration or motive beyond the meaning itself. She wasn't certain yet which kind Tristan was, but she had spent a week reading the walls of this castle, and she had learned to trust the thing in her chest that recognized the difference between performance and truth. She rose before dawn. The castle was at its most honest in the hour before the household woke. No formal arrangements, no careful positioning, just stone and silence and the smell of cold ash from hearths that hadn't yet been restoked. Daisy moved through the lower corridor with her cloak pulled over her dress and her braids still neat from the night before, Nara's work held even after hours on a pillow. She was not leaving. She had promised until morning, and morning had not fully arrived. But she needed to move, needed to think with her feet, rather than lying still in the dark. She took the back stairwell to the upper east corridor, where the old library occupied a long room with 3 arched windows that faced the sunrise. She had discovered it in her first days at Vorthane, when exploring the upper floors during an afternoon with no assigned tasks. The librarian, an elderly wolf named Peth, who seemed to regard the books as personal relatives, had not turned her away. He had simply pointed at a chair near the window and returned to his work, which Daisy had understood as permission. She pushed the library door open now and stopped. Tristan was already there. He was standing at the central table, one hand resting flat on an open map, reading by the light of a single lamp. He had removed the fur mantle and the chest armor. Dressed now in a plain dark tunic and trousers, the leather arm guards still buckled to his forearms, as though he never fully surrendered readiness. His dark braids fell forward slightly as he looked down at the map, and he didn't look up immediately when she entered, though she had no doubt he had heard her. "The sunrise is better from the eastern window," he said, without looking up. "Third one from the left." She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she walked in and chose the chair beside the window he had indicated. The eastern sky was just beginning to change, deep blue thinning at the horizon into something almost gray, the color of the moment just before color returns to the world. "You don't sleep much," she observed. "I sleep when things are resolved," he said. "There are currently several unresolved things." "Such as?" He finally looked up from the map. "You," he said simply. "Among others." She held his gaze. "I'm not a problem to be resolved." "No," he agreed, straightening. "That's not what I meant. I meant that I don't yet understand what I'm looking at, and I don't rest easily with things I don't understand." She turned to the window. The horizon was shifting, that first thin line of pale gold beginning to separate sky from tree line. The forest beyond Vorthane's walls was enormous, dark fir and birch stretching north for miles, and in the early half-light, it looked like the edge of an older world. "Aldred said something last night," Tristan said, "about your lineage." She turned back to him slowly. "I don't have a lineage worth mentioning. My family lost its standing years ago." "Lost its standing," he said, "is not the same as lost its blood." He moved around the table and pulled the second chair to face the window at an angle, sitting with the unhurried ease of someone who had made a decision and was no longer uncertain about it. "What do you know about the Ashvale line?" The name landed strangely. She knew it, distantly, the way one knows the name of a river in a territory one has never visited. An old pack name. Ancient, even. She had heard it mentioned once by her grandmother, years ago, in the context of something long gone. It died out, she said. Generations back. Bloodlines don't die, Tristan said. They scatter. They go quiet. They surface in people who have no idea what they're carrying. He paused. Aldred has the ability to read lineage by presence alone. It's rare. He's been wrong twice in 30 years. Daisy looked at him carefully. What are you saying? I'm saying that what Aldred recognized in you last night is not something I can ignore. And I'm saying that an Omega of Ashvale descent has no business being dismissed from a minor northern estate with a coin purse and an apology. The gold on the horizon was deepening now, spreading upward in slow fingers of light. Daisy was quiet for a long moment, processing the shape of what he was telling her against everything she had believed about herself for years. Even if what Aldred sensed is true, she said finally, it changes nothing about what I am right now. I have no pack. No standing, no resources beyond what I came here with. I know, Tristan said. That's why I'm offering you a choice. He was direct about it, which she appreciated. No elaborate framing, no dramatic construction. He laid it out the way he had laid his hand on the map, flat, clear, covering the full territory. Aldravon needed a formal representative for the Northern Territories, a position that had been vacant for 2 years since the previous holder retired from council duties. It was not a ceremonial post. It required someone who could read people accurately, manage relationships between smaller packs without the political weight of Aldraven crushing them, and maintain presence in courts like Vorthane's without losing their own footing. He had been looking for the right person for a long time. Why me? She asked. You met me last night. I observed you last night, he corrected. I've been watching how you move through this hall for the past 3 hours of that banquet. You rid the room the same way I do. You noticed things that trained council members missed. You kept yourself completely composed through something that would have undone most people. He paused. And you have a lineage that will open doors in the northern courts that my direct representatives can't open without force. You're asking me to work for you. I'm offering you a position with Aldraven's formal protection, a seat on the Northern Council, and the resources to rebuild your family's standing over time. He met her eyes steadily. What Edric Vorthane offered you was a promise that cost him nothing and was abandoned the moment something more convenient appeared. What I'm offering costs me something real. I want that distinction to be clear. Daisy was quiet for a long time. The sunrise had fully arrived now, filling the library window with clean gold light that fell across the old maps and the leather spines of Peth's beloved books and the stone floor between her chair and Tristan's. Somewhere below, the castle was beginning to wake. She could hear the first sounds of the kitchen, distant voices, the clank of the morning water carriers. She thought about her mother's hands, working by candlelight. She thought about the letter folded inside the dress, the promises that had turned to paper. She thought about the walls of this castle, which she had spent a week reading, and about the walls of herself, which she had spent years building carefully around everything that mattered. Then she thought about Nara saying, "You look at the walls," and about how she had always known, somewhere beneath the hope and the planning and the careful construction of reasonable expectations, that she was capable of more than the life she had been handed. "I have conditions," she said. Something in Tristan's expression shifted. Barely. Just that slight adjustment around the eyes she had noticed the night before. "Tell me." "Nara comes with me. She's a capable woman from a lesser pack and she deserves better than Vorthane's lower quarters." "Done. I won't be used as a symbol. If you're putting me on the Northern Council, I'm there to do actual work. That's why I want you there. And I make my own decisions. I am not exchanging one man's arrangements for another's." Tristan looked at her for a moment with that full, unhurried attention. Then he said, "I would expect nothing less. A representative who takes orders without judgment is a messenger, Not a council member. Daisy held his gaze for one more moment. Then she nodded once, slowly, the way one nods when a decision has been made that feels like solid ground rather than a leap. "Then I accept," she said. Outside the library window, the gold light spread across the forest canopy and the stone walls of Vorthane Castle, and somewhere in the eastern courtyard, a horse shook its mane and stamped once against the cobblestones, and the day began in earnest. The morning moved quickly after that. Tristan returned to the guest quarters to prepare his delegation's departure, while Daisy went back to the lower rooms to wake Nara. She did it simply, a hand on her shoulder, a few quiet words, and then watched Nara's dark eyes go from sleep-blurred to wide open in the space of about 4 seconds. "Say that again," Nara said, sitting up. "Aldravan, Northern Council representative. We leave with the Alpha King's delegation this morning." Nara stared at her. Then she looked at the ceiling. Then she looked back at Daisy. "You went to the library and came back employed by the most powerful Alpha in 7 territories. I went to the library and made a decision," Daisy said. "Get dressed. We don't have much time." Nara got dressed. She did it quickly and without further commentary, which was how Daisy knew she was taking it seriously. They packed what little they had between them. Daisy's embroidered dress folded with the same care she always gave it, wrapped in a square of plain linen, and placed at the top of her bag where it wouldn't be crushed. The letter from Edric she left on the bed. Not dramatically, not as a statement. She simply had no more use for it, and she didn't want to carry the weight of something that had already finished. The courtyard was busy by the time they came downstairs. Aldraven's horses were being brought from the eastern stable. Large, dark animals with the particular composure of horses that had traveled long distances many times and were not bothered by noise or crowds. Aldred was overseeing the loading of saddlebags with the focused economy of someone who had done this 1,000 times and saw no reason to make it complicated. Corvin was leaning against the courtyard wall eating an apple he had clearly acquired from somewhere in the kitchen, watching the preparations with cheerful detachment. He saw Daisy and Nara emerge from the lower entrance and raised the apple in a small salute. "You stayed?" he said. "I said I would," Daisy replied. "People say a great many things," Corvin observed pleasantly. "Fewer of them mean it." He looked at Nara with brief, genuine interest. "And you are?" "Nara," she said, with the flat directness of someone who had decided to be unimpressed until given a reason otherwise. Corvin smiled. "Excellent. We've been short on people who look at me like that. It's good for my character." Nara looked at Daisy. Daisy looked forward. Edric found her before they were ready to leave. She had expected it, had heard his voice inside the main hall, asking someone where the Alpha King's delegation was departing, and had simply continued helping Nara secure their bags to the horse that had been assigned them without changing her pace or her expression. He came into the courtyard with the particular energy of someone who has just understood that something has happened that they cannot fully account for, and it was making them move faster than their usual careful deliberateness. "Daisy," he said. She turned to face him. She stood straight, hands at her sides, with the same posture she had held against the wall of the banquet hall the night before. She had practiced stillness for years without knowing she was practicing it. It served her now. "I heard you're leaving with the Aldraven delegation," he said. His voice was controlled, but there was something working underneath it. "Yes," she said. "As what?" "Northern Council representative." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him process this, watched the calculations move behind his eyes, the rapid reassessment of variables that he had clearly not accounted for when he'd told his mother she would understand. "Daisy," he said, and his voice had shifted slightly, toward something softer and more careful. "Last night was a council decision. It wasn't personal. You must understand that these alliances—" "Edric," she said quietly, and the way she said his name stopped him. Not cold, not angry. Simply final. the way the closing of a door is final. I do understand. I understood yesterday afternoon, in the corridor behind the council room. He went still. I heard everything, she said. The coin purse, the generosity. She held his gaze without effort. I'm not telling you this to cause you pain. I'm telling you so that we are both clear that there is nothing unresolved between us. You made your choice. I've made mine. We don't need to make this into something it isn't. He looked at her for a long moment, and something moved across his face that she hadn't expected. Not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it. The expression of someone who has just seen, clearly and too late, the actual dimensions of what they dismissed. I did mean it, he said quietly. At one point. I want you to know that. I know, she said. And she did, and it didn't change anything, and somehow that was all right. Take care of Vorthane, Edric. You're good at that, at least. She turned back to the horse and adjusted the strap on the bag with steady hands. He stood in the courtyard for another moment. Then he went back inside, and she did not watch him go. Tristan appeared at her side without announcement. The way she was beginning to understand was simply how he moved through the world. Ready? He asked. Yes, she said. He looked at her face briefly, reading it the way he read rooms, quickly and completely, and then nodded once and moved toward his own horse without asking what had just happened. He had seen enough to understand, and he had the particular wisdom not to fill silence that didn't need filling. Corvin, naturally, had no such restraint. Was that a dramatic farewell? He asked, appearing at her left elbow. It looked like a dramatic farewell from where I was standing. It was a conclusion, Daisy said. Same thing, different lighting, he said cheerfully, and swung up onto his horse. Nara appeared beside Daisy and spoke low. Are you all right? Daisy considered it honestly for a moment. The embroidered dress was packed safely at the top of her bag. Her mother's work, every stitch intact. She was standing in a courtyard she had arrived at 1 week ago, with a folded letter and a borrowed hope, and she was leaving it with something entirely different, something she had not planned for and could not have predicted, and which felt, underneath the uncertainty of its newness, remarkably like solid ground. Yes, she said, and meant it completely. They rode out through Vorthane's main gate as the morning sun cleared the tree line and fell full and bright across the road north. The forest rose on both sides, dark fir and birch, the smell of wet earth and pine resin, and the particular cold, clean scent of air that has never been inside a building. The horses moved at an easy pace, and the sounds of the castle fell away behind them quickly, replaced by the sounds of the road and the wind in the high branches. Daisy rode between Nara and Corvin, with Aldred somewhere behind and Tristan at the front of the small column, his dark braids catching the morning light. He rode the way he did everything, without performance, without unnecessary movement, simply present and forward. At some point during the first hour, he slowed his horse until he was riding alongside her. They said nothing for a while. The road curved north through the forest, and the light changed as the trees thickened, filtering down in long, pale shafts between the branches. A bird called somewhere deep in the birch, high and clear, and then was quiet. The northern territories are different from this, Tristan said eventually. Older. The packs there have long memories and they don't extend trust quickly. That suits me, Daisy said. I don't extend it quickly either. Good. A pause. The council seat will take time to establish. There will be people who question your standing. There will always be people who question my standing, she said. I've had practice. He looked at her briefly from the side. Yes, he said quietly. I imagine you have. They rode in silence again for a while, and it was the comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't require filling. 3 weeks later, Daisy stood in the great hall of Aldravin for the first time. It was larger than Vorthane in every dimension. Higher ceilings, longer tables, walls hung with the banners of 7 territories rather than 1. The smell was different too, smoke and pine and iron. Something older and deeper than the soft wine and candle scent of Vorthane's social halls. This was a working seat of power, not a decorative one. The council formally recognized her position on the first day. There were 2 members who raised questions, politely, carefully, in the language of procedure, rather than outright challenge. Daisy answered each one with the directness and precision she had been quietly practicing her entire life. In corridors and service rooms and narrow spaces where nobody thought to watch what the quiet woman in the gray cloak was learning. By the end of the session, the questions had stopped. Nara was assigned quarters in the main house and given responsibility for managing the communications between Aldraven's northern contacts and the council, a role that suited her perfectly, and which she attacked with the focused energy of someone who had been waiting a long time for work, worthy of her attention. Corvin stopped by her door on the 3rd evening with 2 cups of spiced wine, and the air of someone making a social call that he would deny was deliberate. She let him in, and they talked for 2 hours about the Northern Pack histories, and she realized he was considerably less light-hearted than he appeared, that the humor was a surface he wore over genuine intelligence, which she found she respected more than if he had simply been one or the other alone. Aldred said nothing to her directly for the first 2 weeks. On the 15th day, he passed her in the corridor outside the map room, stopped, looked at her for a moment with those flat, assessing eyes, and said, "You'll do." Then he continued walking. Nara, who had witnessed this from the far end of the corridor, later informed Daisy that this was the highest praise Aldred had given any person in living memory. As for Tristan, he was exactly what she had read him to be in the library at dawn. He did not make her promises she hadn't asked for. He did not arrange her life according to his preferences, or assume that his offer entitled him to her decisions. He gave her work and the space to do it, and when they spoke, which was often, because their work required it, and because gradually and without announcement, they had both stopped looking for reasons to make the conversation shorter. He listened with the same complete attention he gave to everything, and she found that she did the same. It was not a sudden thing. It was the slow kind, built from shared purpose and honest words, and the particular trust that grows between people who have both learned, through hard experience, that trust is not given. It is demonstrated repeatedly, in small moments, until it no longer needs to be proven. On a cold evening in late autumn, nearly 4 months after they had ridden out of Vorthane together, Daisy stood at the window of the Aldraven library, the real one, enormous and warm, with books lining every wall from floor to ceiling, and watched the first snow of the season fall on the northern forest. Tristan came to stand beside her. They watched the snow in silence for a moment. "Edric Vorthane sent a formal letter to the council last week," he said. "I know. I processed it. He's requesting northern trade access through Aldraven's territories. He'll need to demonstrate pack standing and 3 seasons of reliable tribute before we consider it." She paused. "I'll write the response tomorrow." Tristan was quiet for a moment. Then, "I think your mother would find that satisfying." Daisy looked at the snow falling on the dark trees, at the way the white gathered on the high branches and transformed the forest into something that looked like it belonged to a different world entirely, quieter, older, unbothered by the small urgencies of courts and alliances and promises that cost nothing. "She would," Daisy said. She really would. She had written to her mother 2 weeks after arriving at Aldravon. The letter had taken her 3 drafts to finish, not because she didn't know what to say, but because there was so much of it, and she wanted to get it right. She described the hall, the council, the northern forests, Nara's new role, Corvin's personality, Aldred's single sentence of approval. She described the work and what it required of her and how it fit, the way something fits when it was always the right shape and you simply hadn't found the space for it yet. She had not described Tristan directly. She had said only that she had met someone who offered a choice without conditions, and that she had learned, finally, the difference between that and everything else. Her mother had written back in 11 days, the fastest a letter had ever traveled that distance, which meant she had sent it immediately upon reading. The reply was 3 lines long. I knew the dress would find the right occasion. I am not surprised. I always knew you were built for more than what they offered you. Come home when you can. Bring whoever is worth bringing. Daisy had read it twice, and then folded it carefully, and placed it in the same linen wrapping as the embroidered dress, which hung now in her chamber at Aldraven, not on a peg by the door this time, but properly, on a proper hook, in a room that was hers. Outside, the snow continued to fall on the northern forest, steady and unhurried, covering everything equally. The old paths and the new ones, the things that had ended, and the things that were only just beginning. Inside the library, Tristan and Daisy stood at the window together and watched it. And neither of them needed to say anything more, because some things, when they are finally right, require no announcement at all. They simply are. And this, the work, the trust, the long, honest conversations by lamplight, the northern council seat, Nara's laughter down the hall, the embroidered dress on its proper hook, the letter from her mother folded in clean linen, and the steady presence of a man who had offered a real choice and then honored it every day since. This was Daisy's life now. Not the one she had planned. The one she had earned. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in every way that mattered, exactly right.